Moving on, we are coming to this topic called abstract classes. So, as the definition says over here, the abstract class is one that does not create an object. It is designed only to act as a base class. Example, student in the previous program. So, when we create a program, an object-oriented program, it can be seen that there will be classes where objects are not created. So if you look at this program over here, you have a class called student, which has got its own variables, it has got its own functions like get number and put number. You have a class test, which is inheriting from student. You have a class sports, which is inheriting from student, and it has got its own set of functions and a result which inherits from test as well as sports. But if you look at the main program, you take an object of the class result, which is the ultimate result derived class over here. So you can see that definitely when we create an object oriented programming, there will be classes that does not create an object for its functioning, and it is designed only to act as a base program. So this is a concept of an abstract class. Now we are moving on to the next topic, that is constructors in a derived class. So as you already know, constructors are there. It plays an important role in initializing an object. All these have been taken as a part of module 1, and when we run or when we learn about inheritance schemes, all those programs shown over there were involving constructors. Now, now we are going to see situations, or we are going to see programs where we have a set of default constructors and we have a set of parameterized constructors which belong to both base as well as derived classes. So now you can see that the first point over here, it states that an important note while using constructors during inheritance is that as long as a base class constructor does not take any arguments, the derived class need not have any constructor function. So basically what happens over here is we are going to what happens when we have a set of constructors in the base class and when we have a set of constructors in the derived class. So what it basically says here is that as long as a constructor does not coming back, yeah. So basically the concept here is regarding constructors, and we have constructors in the base class as well as your derived class, and we're going to see how or what happens when we have such constructors and what happens in its function. So we're going to see a program over here. So basically if you look over here, you can see that you have a class called base, and base has its own constructor, and basically it is supposed to display constructor underscore base. You have a derived class over here which is inheriting from base, and you can see that this is an empty class. This does not have a constructor of its own, and basically we can see that you have the main function over here, and in the main function you're creating an object of the derived class. Here we can see that derived obj is there. So obj is being created over here, which is the object of the derived class, and we will see what happens when we run this particular program. So we have this particular compiler over here, and we have running this program, and you can see that yes, it runs the base class constructor. Basically it iterates the fact that when as long as a base class constructor does not take any arguments, you can see that the base class constructor does not take arguments. It is iterated by the fact over here the base class is not having any arguments, or the base class constructor does not contain any arguments, and hence the derived class will not need a constructor defined within it. That is the point mentioned over here, and we have seen that it runs properly. Now, what will happen when we have a parametrized constructor, which means if it is not a default constructor and if it basically takes an argument? We are running this program and you can see that it has led to an error. I hope you're getting the point. In the previous case, we had seen a base class constructor without argument, and now we are seeing a scenario where you are having a base class constructor which is parameterized or which has got an argument. So the solution for this would be to create or to relate a constructor or to create a constructor within the derived class which is related to base class also. So you can see that you have a base class constructor which is parameterized over here, base inde, which means it is parameterized or it has arguments that will be received. And you can see that there is this derived class. So since the program is not working, we have to create a constructor within the derived class. So you can see that the derived class has got a constructor called derived, and it is related to the base class constructor also. It is in fact calling the base class constructor also by passing the argument. So if you look over here, this will be displaying the text constructor underscore derived, and when we look at this program we can see that there is an object created. Now when this object is created, you can see that an object is being initialized with a value int of the data type int, and it is having a value 5. So we'll try running this program. We're going to copy it and we are going to paste it onto the compiler, and you can see that the program runs. Yes. So I hope you're getting the difference between the previous two situations. In this particular program, the one shown over here, the base class did not take any arguments, or it was basically a default constructor, and hence it did not require a constructor in the derived class. But if this is parameterized or this is receiving an argument of any data type, it could be a float, it could be an int. I showed it with an example of int, and basically it is having an argument int, then there is a need for a constructor to be defined within the derived class also. So that is why I wrote this program, and you can see that if it is having any arguments, then it requires a constructor within the derived class which is relating to the constructor of the base class also. So you can see that the program ran, the object was created, it passed the value 5, and you saw that the program runs. Another doubt that could arise at this point of time is, does it have to be specified like this? Like you have a derived class constructor, obviously it is clear, int a, but does it have to be related to the base class constructor also? So now the problem here is, if I comment this particular thing and try to run this program, it creates an error. So if you look over here, you can see that it has created an error, and this error can be attributed to the fact that there is inheritance working over here. So like, you know, when an inheritance runs, you have the base constructor should be run first and the derived constructor should be run second. Now there is no calling happening over here if we just create a derived class constructor over here. So which is why it has to be related to the base class constructor also, because base class constructor is parameterized and the value has to be passed. So I'm reactivating the statement back again. It is calling the base class constructor also. I'm trying to run it, and basically you can see that the program runs. So coming back to this PPT, basically what we said right now is iterated over here in this set of lines. If a base class contains a constructor with one or more arguments, then it is mandatory for the derived class to have a constructor and pass the arguments to the base class constructor. And that exactly happened in that program that we basically showed. Coming to this point, basically it iterates the fact that we already know earlier. Remember, while applying inheritance, we usually create objects using derived class. As seen in the program, the object belongs to the derived class, and it makes sense for the derived class to pass arguments to the base class constructor. When both derived and base class contain constructors, the base class constructor is executed first, and then the constructor in the derived class is executed. This is already something that we have seen all along the concepts of inheritance that we had learned earlier. So in this particular case of programs, we are going to learn about two different cases where we have both default and parameterized constructor in the derived class. So if you look over here, you have a class base over here, and it has got a default constructor base, which will be displaying the text base default constructor. You have a class derived over here, which is basically inheriting from class base, and you can see that it has got two types of constructor. One is a default constructor, which will be displaying the text derived default constructor, and you have a parameterized constructor with indi, and it will display the text derived parameterized constructor. And if you look at this program, you can see that you have an object being created of the base class, you have an object that is created of the derived class, and you have another object d2 which is created of the derived class, but it is actually running a parameterized constructor. So we'll look into this scenario and how this program actually runs. So basically you can see that it's the same program over here, and when I try running this program once again, you can see that it has created an output of this sort. That means base default constructor, derived default constructor, base default constructor, and derived parameterized constructor. Now, how do you think this would have happened? Let us see how the objects are being created. So the first object being created is of the base class. If you look over here, the first object created is of the base class, which means it will run the base class constructor, and hence you have the base default constructor statement displayed. The second object created is d1, which belongs to the derived class. So what do you expect to be run? Basically the base class constructor, which is a default, and since the object created is of the default nature, or since it runs a default constructor, the basic output will be base default constructor as seen over here, followed by derived default constructor as seen over here, only because of the fact that the object created here does not pass any argument. But if you look at the second case where you have object d2, it is passing an argument called 10. If you look at this, when this object is created, naturally it will run the base class constructor, which is default constructor, and you can see that the base default constructor is displayed. Similarly, since it is having an argument 10, it will be running the parameterized constructor only, and you can see that it will be displaying derived parameterized constructor as seen over here. So this basically sums up the situation over here. This is a case where we have a parameterized constructor in the derived class. Now what you can basically do is another set of programs there over here, which is about base class parameterized constructor. Yes, so we were talking about parameterized constructor in the base class, and you can see that basically you have a base class over here which is having a parameterized constructor base indi, which will be receiving the value I and it will be storing in x, and you have the similar parameterized constructor in j also in the derived class. Again, this was shown in one of the previous programs, so basically the concept should be clear over here. But I'm going to explain a situation over here where what happens if we have a default as well as parameterized constructor in the base class. So if you look over here, I'm going to explain this scenario over here. You have a class base, you have a default constructor base also declared over here, which will display the text base default constructor. You have the parameterized constructor base also, which is running in the same manner. You have the derived class constructor also, which is in calling the function base, and we try running this program, and you can see that basically it will be displaying the statement base parameterized constructor and derived parameterized constructor, because it is calling this function j, or the base constructor, which is parameter. Additionally, if you look over here, I made a small modification also over here. So you have a derived class constructor which is calling the default constructor of the base class. If you look over here, this has got no argument in comparison with the previous program. So I removed the argument and I try running this, and basically it is basically running the base default constructor as well as the derived parameterized constructor.